Okay. So
You are talking about the goal of Israel, the state?
I'm talking about, I'll get to it. I just started the recording. It's like this, basically. The Zionist movement was a dream. The dream was to create a state for the Jews. And because nobody wanted to look so far in the future, the easiest common denominator was it would be a shelter against anti-Semitism. Everybody could agree on that. So that was the platform in 1897 of the first Zionist Congress of Theodor Herzl, that the state of Israel, which eventually would be created, would be a shelter for Jews wherever they're running away from. And actually, for a great part of the history of the state, that's exactly what it was. As I showed, 80% of the Jews who came to Israel came as refugees. That's a lot of people. It's a vast majority. I mean, they always talk about the Palestinian refugees, but all the Jews were refugees who came to Israel. If anything, Palestinians came from Iraq, they came from Syria, they came from Egypt, they weren't so far away. Jordan. So, okay. So what I wanted to say was, because Zionism was a dream, and nobody could think further than the question of setting up a state, because even setting up a state seemed like a dream. So the fact that it happened sort of proved that the Zionist movement worked. And that was like it. That's it, right? We have a state. The only problem is when you have a state, now the question is, what is the goal? Now, normally you don't have to ask that question. You set up a country like Canada, which started in 1867. You don't have to ask the question, what was the goal of Canada? Because Canada was set up as a free society, and that's it. There was no goal. But Israel has a history, and the Jewish people have a tradition and a religion. So, unfortunately, you have to ask that question, because there are a lot of assumptions that people are going to make whether you ask that question or not about the state of Israel, and a lot of assumptions that Jews will make about the state of Israel. And the Zionist movement, even the secularists among them, played with that assumption all the time. The Hebrew University calls itself the University of the Jewish People. Why? You could ask the question. What makes you the University of the Jewish People? Because we're in Israel. Oh, in other words, you're saying that the goal of Israel is to be the country of all the Jewish people, not only the people living in it, right? You didn't say that. So, it does say that, by the way, in the Declaration of Independence of Israel. But I'm saying that Israel, even if you read the Declaration of Independence, it's saying a lot of things about the state of Israel, which nobody had discussed till that point. It talks about it as the fulfillment of the prophets, meaning the prophets are the inspiration, if you want to call it that way. A lot of things. That Declaration of Independence is very traditional, despite the fact that the people who think, today now they're talking a lot in Israel that we want the Declaration of Independence to be part of the Constitution. If the Declaration was part of the Constitution, I think a lot of the secularists in Israel would not be happy with that. But they think they never read it, so they don't know what it says. Anyhow, but I'm just saying, because people who wrote the Declaration of Independence were very Jewish, even the ones who were not who were secular. But in their mind, they grew up in very Jewish homes. So a lot of things were like obvious to them, which today is not obvious for the regular secularists. Just a different mindset. Okay, let me go back to this, because I want to still go to this issue and finish this off to understand what's going on in Israel today. It's a little complicated, but when you go slowly, you do achieve this. So I'm going back to the political parties. 1967 is a watershed movement. You were asking me about 1967, right? About the war. Who asked me? Oh, Laura? Maybe it was Laura, who's not here now. Okay.
I asked you about the 6-day war, the 6-day war.
6-Day War, yes, yes.
Exactly. Yes,
Okay,
yes.
so what happened? Oh, I didn't do share, I'm sorry. I did not do share. That's what happened. Okay, there you are, now I can see. The 6-Day War is a watershed movement in two different ways. It's a watershed moment in Jewish history. Number one, it eventually creates an argument, but not right away, about what are we supposed to do with the land that we took over from Jordan and from Egypt. The interesting thing is, by the way, and from Syria, the interesting thing is that when we look back in time, today, Egypt, you know, when we made accords with Egypt, they said, you can have the Gaza Strip, we don't want it. Because Menachem Begin said, it's okay, we'll give you, together with the Sinai, they said, we want the Sinai, we don't want the Gaza Strip, bye-bye. And that's really what happened. And Jordan, they washed their hands for the West Bank. They said, we don't need it. Because they didn't want all those Palestinians. They have enough problems with their Palestinians. So Jordan officially said that it's not interested in the West Bank. Egypt officially said it's not interested in Gaza. Legally, the only person it belongs to is the state of Israel. And the Golan, of course, we declared the Golan as part of the state, and it was recognized internationally. So there are a lot of things that have nothing to do with law and the arguments that have to do with these issues. But let me get to it. What are the two issues of the 6-Day War? Issue number one is a political issue. And the political issue is, what are we supposed to do with that land? Are we supposed to just declare it part of Israel? At the beginning, the Labor Party, who was in power after 67, was afraid. They said, well, let's use it as bargaining chips. We want to have peace with Egypt, want to have peace with Jordan, want to have peace with Syria and Lebanon. We'll use the land, we won't do anything there, we'll leave it as bargaining chips. And they were sure that would work. So Moshe Dayan waits for a phone call from Nasser. There was even a song about it called, and no, it said Rabin, who eventually became, you know, he took over Yitzhak Rabin. So there was a song in Israel called Rabin is waiting for Nasser. There was a famous song after the 6-Day War because the idea was the phone call. They were waiting for a phone call from Nasser. They were waiting for a phone call from Hussein. And Hussein and Nasser would say, okay, we want the land back. We'll make peace. Never happened. 1968 didn't happen. 1969 didn't happen. 1970 didn't happen. That's when they realized they don't want it back. Okay, or at least not for the price of peace. And then the question was what to do. Now, again, the Labor Party believed that this was biblical land of Israel. They just were very practical. They said to themselves, you know, if they call, it's worth giving them this land, which we did not build on in the meantime, for a peace agreement. Everybody would have, probably everybody in the country would have understood that at the time. But by 1970, there were groups who realized it wasn't going to happen. There was a movement that started in Israel. It was called the settlement. It happened in 1970. The settlement movement, which was a grassroots movement of people who wanted to start building houses in the West Bank and Gaza, but mostly the West Bank because it's literally next to Jerusalem. It goes right through Jerusalem, actually. They said, let's start building. Well, let's use it for something. And they started building settlements and things like that. Now, just to show you how pro Golda Meir's government was as a Labor Party, you would have the settlement movement, which was mostly religious people, would go to the top of a settlement, of a hill somewhere, and they say, this is going to be the settlement of, what do they got out there? Whatever. Shavei Shomron, let's say. Okay. And then the government said, no, no, no. Then bring in Chayalim, bring in soldiers, take them down, whatever. Then again, they would go to the top of the hill. And again, the government would go take this on, come down. And then the government said, you know what? You can't do it on this hill. We'll give you another hill. So they'll go to the other hill, and then the government set up the electricity and made roads, etc. So wait a second, are they pro or are they against? This happened as long as Golda Meir was prime minister. It was this sort of like cat and mouse. The settlers would go to the hilltops. They would say, we're settling here. The government say, no, no, no. They'd bring in the soldiers, bring them down, and then give them another site. There you can go, not here. And many, many settlements were set up under the Labor Party. From 1970 to 1977. It wasn't just a 1 or 2 years. For 7 years under Golda Meir and Yitzhak Rabin, Rabin was only like 2 years in the middle. This was all, this is what went on. So obviously the government was not against. You brought in the electricity, you brought in the infrastructure. Comes along the Likud 1977, which is its own thing. And everybody assumes the Likud is going to just let them because the Likud is right wing and they believe in settlements. Begin does the same thing. He says he can't be on that hilltop. He brings in the soldiers, takes them down from the hilltop, go over there. Exactly like Golda Meir. He doesn't change anything. He does exactly the same thing. That's what I'm saying. The Labor Party and what eventually becomes the Likud were identical in their relationship to the land of Israel. Absolutely identical. People look at the Labor Party today and they try to extrapolate how it was then. There's no connection. The Labor Party today is not even the same people. It's not even the children of the same people. It's a totally different party. And it's a very small party, by the way, because of that. Today, oh, by the way, the second thing that happened in the 6-Day War, which was very, very significant, because we took over the old city of Jerusalem, it created something among world Jewry that for the first time since 1948 saw Israel as the religious center of the Jewish people, not just the national center. Even Israelis were starting to feel something about this idea. Even the secular Israelis understood that something had happened in 1967. And then the question is, what is going to be with the state of Israel? Because until 1967, the assumption was this is a secular state of Jews. You want to be religious, but this is a secular state. After 1967, it wasn't clear anymore. And if it's going to be imbued with some type of Jewish traditionality, in what sense? Right? Who's going to decide? Will it be the religious? Will it be the secular? Will it be the traditionalists? Another thing happens, by the way. I mentioned today before the aliyot, but let's look back at those aliyot that happened. And let me explain what I'm looking at. Next page. The next page is the religiosity of Jews. Remember, Jews are 78% of the country today. But religiosity of Jews, this is based on statistics that I saw from a Gutman report from 1999. So I'm sort of like extrapolating from there, but it's not that far off. Okay, the Haredim, which means ultra-Orthodox, are about 10% of the country. They have large families. They used to be 8%, now they're 10%, despite the fact that the country grew. By the way, the Haredim have more children than the Arabs, the ultra-Orthodox. Then you have the religious Zionists, which outside of Israel would be called modern religious, but they don't have that concept in Israel. So they just say religious Zionists. They're about 18% of the Jews. Then you have the traditionalists. Traditionalists was a term which was used for the Mizrahi Jews. Because the Jews who came from Arab countries, they're all religious originally. All of them. Except for maybe Iran. Because Iran already in the 70s became very secular, but at least the ones who came earlier were religious. So the Mizrahi Jews were basically religious. They never went through an emancipation. They didn't live in countries that were secular. You were either Jewish or you're Muslim. There was no option in these countries for something else. Okay, you could be Christian in some of them and then be persecuted. But I'm just saying they didn't have secular options because they never went through emancipation. This wasn't Europe. So the Jews were basically traditionalists, very religious, less religious, but they're all traditionalists, just like the Jews of Russia and Poland and Eastern Europe before the 20th century. There was no real emancipation in most of those countries. So what happened was, by 1970, 50% of the state of Israel was the Mizrahi Jews. By 1970, they also had more kids. That means that probably by 1970, the majority of the country was either religious or traditional. And this was a country that was set up as a secular country. But the religious population was growing by leaps and bounds. It didn't seem justified anymore. If you're actually democratic, isn't it supposed to be the will of the people, not the will of the people who set up the country, but the will of the people who live in the country? This became a very interesting issue in Israel, which never happened. And this happened at the same time as more or less the Six-Day War. Because by 1970, all the Arab countries had emptied themselves out of these Mizrahi Jews. Most of them are living in Israel at that time, and they're almost all traditional, if not religious. So, just to give you an example, Israel was just third place in the Eurovision, right? The girl Noah Kiriel is from a Mizrahi family. There was a funny story with her. She was on the plane. Did you see this? There's a funny story. She was on the plane coming back in the business class, and next to her, this rabbi, Gush Etzion, was sitting. And the pilot said, "We want to say thank you for Noah and congratulations." So he hears this and he turns to the girl sitting next to her. He didn't know that was her. He says, "Who's Noah?" He says, "That's me." He says, "Why are they congratulating you?" He says, "Well, I got third place in the Eurovision." He says, "Oh, really? What's your family name?" She's thinking, "How can you not know that?" He says, and then her mother, she was sitting next to her mother in the plane. Her mother pops her head over and says, "You know, Rabbi son," he says, "Who are you?" He says, "I'm the rabbi of such and such area in Israel." She says, "You know that our grandfather was a rabbi too, and where I don't know where she's from, Morocco or something like that." And they get in this whole discussion. And then Noah says, "You know, I said these blessings in the morning before I did Eurovision from the prayer book." I do that every now and then. These are Mizrahi Jews, they act very secular sometimes, but hey, you need them for the synagogue, not a problem. They're there in 10 minutes. They're very traditional in their mindset, as opposed to, let's say, Ashkenazic Jews. When Ashkenazic Jews get secular, they are secular. They don't walk into the synagogue anymore. They don't want to be identified with those backwards concepts. But the Mizrahi Jews are not like that. They always have a soft spot for Jewish tradition. It doesn't matter if they keep the Sabbath, don't keep the Sabbath. Yeah, it's just a different mindset. So even today, there were a few decades after this already, quite a few decades after, the Mizrahi Jews are still by and far traditionally, are by and far majority are traditionalists, even if they're not as religious as their parents and grandparents. So look at this. So Haredim were about 10%, religious Zionists about 18% of the Jews. The traditionalists are about 32%. When we say traditionalists, it's mostly Mizrahi. You have what I call slightly traditional, basically secularists who Yom Kippur they'll fast, Pesach, that's about another 28%. Then you have the hard secularists, like atheists, whatever, about 10%. Really, a very small part of the country is very. I remember I used to teach in Ashkelon College, which was under Bar Ilan. And I was in one of my classes, I was explaining what a secular Jew is. Secular means somebody who doesn't believe in God. The whole class wanted to throw apples and oranges at me. How dare you say that a secularist is not somebody who believes in God? We all believe in God in this class. Okay, there was mostly Mizrahi Jews. It was Ashkelon. And I said, that's not an offensive statement. I'm just defining secular. That's what it means. I'm sorry. It's like, okay, let's keep going. Now look by ethnicity. I'm taking the same thing now by ethnicity. Sephardi and Middle Eastern Jews they're probably about 30% religious or Haredi, and not just differentiate. Haredi means ultra Orthodox. And then about 50% of them are about traditional, and maybe 10% are secular. You don't have a lot of Mizrahi Jews who are diehard secularists. Usually they're traditional to some extent, whether a little bit or a lot, but they Ashkenazic Jews, no more than 28% consider themselves religious or Haredi. Maybe 15% are traditional, at least 60% consider themselves secular. You see how different it is. This is not exact. There might be some mistakes, but it's not far from the situation. The vast majority of the real secularists in Israel happen to be Ashkenazi. So what happens is that you have two rifts going on in the society between religious and secular, and between Ashkenazi and Sephardi because of the tradition too. Okay. Okay, I just wanted to point that out. 1977. All of a sudden, somebody else gets into government, Menachem Begin. How did it happen? Did they lose their touch? No. Remember, there were many reasons, there were many tricks that the Labor Party did to keep their majority in the government, without going into detail. You know, in the early years, it was 100% justified because it destabilizes a country to switch to whatever. But you know, after 30 years, it doesn't seem to be justified anymore. Probably not even after 20. But two things happen that bring Menachem Begin into number one, which is the most important of this, is the Sephardi Jews. The Sephardi Jews who came from the North Africa and the Arab countries always felt that the labor government institutions were patronizing. We brought you here, we'll tell you what to do. You want your backwards religion, we have no problem with that, but try to be more like us. It was very much like that, okay? I'm not going to all the stories. There were stories too. I don't blame Ben Gurion, but I blame some of the clerks underneath him. Sometimes, like, just to give an example, you would come from an Arab country, all the literature from the government, there was nothing in Arabic for you. So you couldn't understand anything there. Today, you have English, Hebrew, Arabic, Russian, Ethiopian. But in those days, on purpose, Arabic is not one of the languages that we're interested in. We don't want you speaking that. And so people would come from Egypt, from Syria. They had no clue what they were. They knew a little bit of Hebrew, but not enough really to understand the literature, which they were, what's going on. It's your problem. You'll learn Hebrew. We're not going to talk to you in Arabic. So you have these problems. And that's just a small part of it. If they're orphan children, they were sent to a secular kibbutz, not necessarily to a religious one. Anyhow, so there was this feeling which created a lot of animosity among Sephardic Jews living in Israel. This patronizing, they're like, who decided it's your country? Okay, you were here before we were here, but now there are a lot of us here. So it's our country. Our children were born here already, And there was really this patronizing, like, you have to know your place. We brought you from these backward countries. We're helping you out, but now you got to follow suit and do what we want you to. There was a lot of that type of talk going on in the country. Along comes Menachem Begin. Now, what happens? Menachem Begin was not so known to the Mizrahi Jews. He wasn't a Mizrahi Jew. He's a Polish Jew. He did come from a traditional background, by the way. But he was not that traditional. He wasn't religious, but he was traditional, and he liked the traditions. So it's easier for a Mizrahi Jew to connect to a Jew who likes the traditions. There was a Jew, Israeli comedian by the name of his name escapes me at the moment. But what happened was that every election, the Labor Party would bring in comedians and singers And this time the Likud did that too. And they brought in a comedian, Dudu Topaz, that was his name. Dudu Topaz. And he gets up at a rally for the Labor Party, and everybody is there from the Labor Party, thousands of people. And Topaz says, Menachem Begin is trying to win this election. There we go. Goes boo, boo, whatever. And Topaz says, but all those people voting for him, they're just chachchachim, which is Hebrew sort of like the dregs of society, okay? Why chachchachim? Because since the Mizrahi Jews spoke Arabic, it sounds like, you know what I mean? For those who don't understand Arabic. So it became a derogatory term for people from Arab countries. They called them chachchachim, and the chachchachim called the Ashkenazic Jews buzbuzi. They boss, like from Yiddish, buzbuzi. So Dudu Topaz says, the only people who vote for this guy is chachchachim, okay? But it was derogatory, okay? And everybody applauded, okay? Oh, that was like, for the Mizrahi Jews, that was the moment they wanted to take their revenge. Not only these guys been patronizing, now they're calling us names. The next week, Menachem Begin had a rally for his Likud party, who never had a lot of seats, by the way. I told you, they never passed like 15 seats. He says, there was a rally a week ago for the labor, and there was a comedian. His name was Dudu Topaz, I think. Everybody in his rally is going, boo, because the majority of the people of his rally were these Eitot Mizrach, were these Mizrahi Jews who came from the Arab countries, because they really felt no connection to the Labor Party at this point. And then Bacon tells the story. Oh, he says, and he's calling, he said, he mentions this, and he used a strange word, okay. Everybody goes, says, how can you dare to say such things about such wonderful people? He goes on and on. And then he tells the story about these two guys from the Cherut, which was his party, who were killed by the British because, they had, whatever, on the gallows. And he says, and who are the two? There was Barazani, I forget who the other guy was. And says one of them was an Ashkenazic Jew, one of them was an Iraqi Jew, and they died in each other's arms. Now, I don't know if that's exactly what happened, but people loved it. That was it. So, and by the way, and he said, and they were brothers. Now, you have to understand, not only brothers, the Sephardi Jews have this term, whenever they turn to somebody, they say, like the Afro-Americans, hey, bro, achim, achshali. They always say achshali. So when you say they were brothers, which is exactly a term that they use all the time, okay? So, but that's not what clinched it. That probably gave him another 15 seats, but it wasn't what clinched it. What clinched it also was, there was a breakoff from the Labor Party. Yigal Yadin and Moshe Dayan had a fight. There's an internal fight. They started their own party, and Begin made a coalition with them. So between all the Sephardic Jews who predominantly voted for Menachem Begin in opposition, I mean, this was really in defiance. They were afraid, by the way, they were afraid to lose their jobs, but this is in defiance of the Labor Party. And then because within the Labor Party, there was a splinter faction that broke off, which had about 20 seats, that clinched it. But nobody expected it to happen. It really was a watershed movement in Israeli politics. And it continued, by the way, that way. Since 1977, most of the governments have been Likud governments. Most, not all of them, but most of them have been. And a lot of it is because the Mizrahim didn't want the labor coming back ever. They wanted to punish them. It wasn't about the Likud. It was like, not those guys. Now, anyhow, what happened was, but there was another thing. The Likud realized that you have to start talking like traditionalists. They don't want to hear about secularism. They want to hear Judaism is good. They want to hear our tradition is good. So what happened, the Likud was never a religious party. Menachem Begin personally was a traditional Jew, but the party was never religious. And in fact, the people who ran the Likud party were secular Ashkenazim, exactly like the Labor Party. But they understood what David Ben-Gurion understood. You have to work together with the religious elements if you want to have a government, because things could change. And what happened was the religious parties after that also, once they got used to Menachem Begin, they didn't want to go back to the labor anymore. And then you had all these, so anyhow, so what happened was, so basically today, look, if you look at the list now, the first thing you had after 1967 was you had the parties who wanted to give these lands back to the Arabs, even without an agreement. That was only like the Meretz party, extreme left party. Why was it extreme left? Because it wanted a two-state solution. Then you had the Labor Party, but the Labor Party became more and more left-wing. What as I said before, the Labor Party and the Likud really had very little difference between them. But over the years, since the time of Rabin was one of the few left over from the early Labor Party. He was still what we today call in Israel right-wing in his thinking, despite the fact that he was the head of the Labor Party. Harris made a changeover in his mindset. He was from that same early party, but he changed his mind over the years. Rabin never did. And then what happened was more and more elements entering the Labor Party actually came from the Israeli left. So that today, the head of the Labor Party is a woman who's really from the Israeli left. She's not from the centrist anymore. And that's why the Labor Party lost so many votes. Because most people in Israel, whether on the right or the left, they like the center. They consider the center moderate. That's why Likud gets most of the votes, and the centrist parties will get most of the votes. So as long as the Labor was close to the center, they got most of the votes, which were not on the right, and the Likud got most of the votes that were on the right. Because even on the right, people like the centrists. Okay, you have the religious parties, but that's because there's another agenda going on. But the religious parties don't expect themselves to be the prime minister, except for Naftali Bennett. But normally they don't expect that. They expect to be either with the Labor or the Likud. But the Labor fell apart because it was basically taken over by very left-wing groups. Because the Labor never believed in the two-state solution. Rabin didn't believe in it. 2 weeks before the elections, 2 weeks before he was elected, in 1992, I think it was, he said, we're not in for a two-state solution. We're not going back to 1967 borders. You can still see it on YouTube. He didn't know about the Oslo Accords. I'm sure of it. Yeah. But Paris did. Anyhow, so what am I saying now? One of the issues now that has become is that Israeli left has remained very secular. And the Israeli right has all the religious and the traditionalists. So it's not just an argument about what to do with the West Bank and Gaza anymore. It's an argument on how to see the state of Israel. Everybody on the right, even if they're seculars within the Likud, they understand that Israel has to have a traditional side to it, or else it's not going to accommodate all the Jews who are living here already. And the people on the left are not so happy about that. What I am happy about is that there's one party on the left today, which is centrist, which is sort of like turn back the clock as far as the Labor Party. It's not the Labor Party, it's Benny Gantz. Benny Gantz is now originally Yair Lapid's party, Yesh Atid, tried to do that. He had traditionalists and some religious in his party, but he got rid of most of them except for maybe one. But Benny Gantz, who himself is a slightly traditionalist, his party, which is centrist, slightly left, does have a mixture. So it is an attempt to try to replace the left in the center. And if there's going to be another leader from the left, he has the best chance at this moment. And it's not only because of what happened the last couple of weeks, because even people on the left, nobody likes radical governments. Nobody. Even the radicals don't like radical governments. People like governments in the center, and you argue with them if you're the radical. That's usually the way it works. And so, again, if the left wants to get in power, they're going to need somebody like Benny Gantz, who it's okay that, and even the extreme left understands that. The same way that the religious, even on the right wing, even this extreme right wing understand that it's got to be something like the Likud, who's in government, because that's what most of the people want, whether they're religious or not. That's the way it is in most countries. And that's the way it also is in Israel. So what I was trying to show here is the issue that's going on, the issue that started off in 1967 about what to do with the West Bank and Gaza, which sort of at this moment has become a non-issue because of the fact that since the Oslo Accords, the people running the West Bank and Gaza have absolutely no interest in making peace with Israel. I mean, that's in that sense, the Oslo Accords were a major failure because now, today, the Arab countries do want peace with Israel. There's some Muslim countries that don't, like Turkey is on the fence, and definitely Iran doesn't want it, but they're not Arab. The Arab countries today do want peace with Israel, and they're stuck because the Palestinians don't. They don't like the Palestinians. They're not allowed to say that openly, but they want the problem solved one way or another. If Israel would come up with a solution, which made sense, probably behind the scenes, all the Arab countries would agree, because they see the Palestinians are these like spoiled kids. It's like no matter what you offer them, it's no good. That's the way. That's just unfortunately, fortunately or unfortunately, that's the way it's become. If you notice, that Saudi Arabia just recently he told Joe Biden said, "What do we want you to make a deal with Israel? Give us your 4 conditions." None of them had to do with the Palestinians. That would have never been 15 years ago. Okay. Thank you. Okay. Yalla, bye. Nice to see you. Yeah, I'll just continue this for a little bit. So all I'm saying is that there are 2 issues now. In my opinion, the Palestinians are a secondary issue. It will be worked out with the Arab countries, in my opinion, because that's the only way to work it out. It can't be worked out just with the Americans or the Europeans. It has to be worked out directly with the Arab countries. And I think at this point, the Arab countries do want these things worked out. And so Israel will have to explain what they want and how it's going to work. But the people have to back it too. But the second thing which is going to happen in Israel is going to be much more complicated because it will be how does Israel see itself as a Jewish state and not just a state of Jews? That's a very complicated question. The answer, by the way, is not so complicated, but it can't be an issue which is solved by politicians. It has to be an issue which is solved by thinkers and ideologues. Politicians don't like solutions, or else who's going to vote for them? If I can work out a deal with the guy in the opposition, then you don't need me anymore. You can have the guy in the opposition. That's why politicians it's very hard for them to create unity in a country. If the country's being attacked, then yeah, they can get together with it. But normally on the day-to-day, in Hebrew, the word for a party is miflaga, which means a division. Because that's what they do. They divide the people. It's a problem. If you have a statesman who can bring the people together, that's a big deal. And that's exactly what Israel needs today. Today, they need a statesman who can bring the people together. And you need also some type of, I call it, in my opinion, we need 2 things. Number 1 is a new social contract, what Rousseau called the social contract. In other words, how do we see society, Israeli society? Which way is it going? That's a social contract. What do we want as a society? I think it's possible, but somebody has to work on it and has to work on it together with a lot of different parts of the society working at the same time. You can't have a group who's from one side doing it or from the other side doing it. It really has to be what they call in the States bipartisan. How do we see society in general? It has to be first among the Jews and then also among all the other ethnicities that are living in Israel. It has to be worked out with the Israeli Arabs, who've been living with us for a significant amount of time at this point. How do they see their place? And the way they see their place, they have to define it and then abide by it. That's the social contract. We're defining it. Everybody's agreeing. This is what you got to do, right? And the different parts of Israeli society. This can't be left up to the politicians, because if it's left up to the politicians, okay, it gives reason to fight, and reason to fight means more votes. You don't want that. You want the social contract. The politicians won't want it, but the people need it. The second thing is, once there's a social contract, you can make a constitution. Israel, like Britain and New Zealand, does not have a constitution. In Britain, it works. New Zealand seems to work. In Israel, it did work until recently. But, well, maybe if we had a Senate, it might have been better, because then you have like two factions and one could oversee the other. But the problem is, in Israel, all we have is a parliament and a Supreme Court. And they don't actually oversee each other. Sometimes there's a tug of war. There is a problem going on. But if you have a constitution, it defines what the court's supposed to be doing, what the government's supposed to be doing. Once you have definitions in the constitution, it solves the problem. Now, why wasn't there a constitution when the country was set up? Why do I say why was there? Because in 1948, the Ben-Gurion government said that they were going to work on a constitution. It just never happened. It was supposed to be done in 1949. There was actually a constitution that was written up but never used. There are two possibilities. Possibility number one, which is the one they usually mention, is that the religious wouldn't agree because they want the Torah to be the constitution, whatever. I'm not sure that's 100% correct. For instance, Rabbi Herzog, who was the first chief rabbi of Israel, he wrote a whole book about having a constitution in Israel. There were others who did the same. Others say that Ben-Gurion didn't want a constitution because he wanted to call the shots. And if you don't have a constitution officially, nothing the Supreme Court says is binding. And especially when you're running the country in a sense that there's nobody who can really oppose you, it's just so much easier. So some people say that that was part of it too. But we're at a point now where I think having a constitution would be beneficial to the country. But as I said, it has to be a two-step process, in my opinion. Social contract and then constitution. That will define the rights of everybody in the country. What is the place of religion? What is the place of the rights of the individual? All these things have to be defined, not into great detail, but in general, these type of things. And this will also help bring the country together more. It is together in general, but there are always troublemakers. So it's always good to have these things too. Okay, that was basically what I wanted to say. There's always more what to say, and I'll think about that for next time, which is, I guess, will be around the 8th of June. But what I did until now was I went over the history from the beginning of Zionism, and we even started off with some of the denominations in Judaism, bringing it up to the groups that are in Israel today, and understanding some of the issues. One of the big issues in 1967 was how to treat the Arabs and how to see the West Bank and Gaza, which created the whole two movements in Israel, the settlement movement on the one hand side, and the two-state movement, which also only started after 1967, because there was no possibility of a two-state before 1967, more than any land. So those were two movements that started. These movements became influential on both sides. The settlement movement influenced the right side of the political map. The two-state solution eventually even influenced the Labor Party, even though they didn't start from the Labor Party. And today, by the way, people like Benny Gantz and Yair Lapid, who are now the two largest parties in the opposition, they don't even talk about that anymore. They don't say they're against, but they just say it's not relevant at the moment. At least Benny Gantz is. So, and then the second issue was how you see the state of Israel. What is going to be the place of tradition and the religion within the country? Because you have some of the secularists who are saying, well, you know, we don't want to have a connection between all these religious things. We want total secularism. We don't want the rabbis doing divorce and marriage. We don't want to have to, you know. And on the other hand, there are people who want actually more of it. They want the country to be more influenced by tradition. So where's the modus vivendi? What are you supposed to do? See, if you're living in New York, you can live with the Hasidim or without the Hasidim. Right? You can be with you're a secularist, live among non-Jews. You can be a secularist there. That's okay. You never have to see a religious Jew in your whole life. But in Israel, we're all in the same ship. Okay, some people are in the cabin over there, in the cabin over there, but you're going to bump into them all the time because it's the same ship. So that's why you need to have a social contract. How the things can work. Okay, merci beaucoup, everybody. I think I will.